Okay, good. Hi. Welcome. My name is Dawn Beck. Um, I am up here in the Pacific Northwest. I'm a master beekeeper through the University of Montana and through Cornell University. And I'm on the board of three different bee clubs and on the board of WASBA. And so I tend to go really, really deep into my hobbies. And so I'm retired, and beekeeping is my hobby. And so it's kind of become more than a full-time job, and I'm really, really loving it. It gets a little, as you all know, as beekeepers, it gets a little exhausting sometimes, but I absolutely love beekeeping. So this is a presentation. So when I was going through the Cornell program, it's a really challenging program. And one of the things that you have to do for your finals is create a presentation. And they told us that in the first quarter. And and so I thought, great, I like giving presentations. So I got started on it like many months early and got a good handle on this entire hour-long presentation. In fact, I was giving the presentation even before finals, and then I found out it only had to be 15 minutes. So we got a whole hour presentation anyway. But this is a topic that is really near and dear to my heart. We're going to talk about fat bodies with bees. And to my way of thinking, understanding what a fat body is and how it affects the bees is one of the single most important concepts in keeping your bees healthy and alive over winter. So we're gonna really dive in and really learn about this essential organ, and I think you'll find it really enlightening, and it'll really help you with your bees. Um, so my goal is to help people to successfully overwinter their bees. It took me a number of years to learn how to do that. And fat bodies, having a healthy fat body literally is the key to bees overwintering. When I first started beekeeping, and I've only been at this for about 10 years, but when I first started, when folks talked about varroa mites and how varroa mites damaged bees, they talked about them drinking hemolymph, similar to a tick. And then Sammy Ramsey came out and said, no, it's the fat body and not hemolymph. So at that point, I needed to know what a fat body was, and what the damage was, and if it's something that the bee could recover from. Is that something that we can support and help them overcome damaged fat bodies or not? So then when the Cornell studies required a presentation, this was the one that really interested me. So it was really fun. I went in and did a whole lot of research, printed out a lot of papers, and consolidated all of that information in a way that I hope flows and makes sense to you without actually having to go and read a whole bunch of papers. So first thing we're going to look at is the biology of what a fat body is. So it's in this picture here, and it's illustrated in red. Now it's not actually red, it's white. It looks more like a blob of fat. Um, but it's incredibly important to the entire colony. It functions kind of like a combination of a human liver and human fat cells. The liver-like function provides immunity and filters out toxins, and the fat cell function creates a storage of food, and not just for that bee, but it's how basically the entire colony is fed. It metabolizes food, and then the bee can then feed it back out to others. Um, the, so what happens is the fat body is what uh, metabolizes the proteins in pollen. Let's see. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the different glands that are involved in it. So you've got fat bodies here, and then the green portion here is kind of the hemolymph. And hemolymph is like an open circulatory system. So bees don't have veins. They have their whole body is full of liquid that nutrients and things can transport through that. So what the bee does is the nurse bees eat pollen, and the fat body metabolizes the proteins in pollen into a food that the bee can use. And only the pretty much mostly the nurse bees are the ones who eat pollen. And the nurse bees are pretty much the primary ones who make the vitellogenin, which is then made into royal jelly. So the fat body takes the pollen and breaks it down and into vitellogenin. Remember, vitellogenin is that white liquid that is the primary ingredient in royal jelly and in brood food. So the vitellogenin goes from the fat body through the hemolymph up to the bee's head. And up in the bee's head is a gland you may have heard of called the hypopharyngeal glands. So that is where the bee processes the proteins in the vitellogenin into royal jelly and brood food. It's then transported from the hypopharyngeal glands down into the mandibular glands, which are right next to their mandibles. And that's where the food comes out. So when they're doing trophallaxis and they're feeding each other, there's these glands right next to the mandibles where they can share food. Let's see. So let's go on to the next slide. We might come back to this one. This is what a fat body actually looks like. And you can see that's probably why it was called a fat body, because it looks like a glob of fat. And you can actually see this under a microscope. It's a measure of bees' health, how big and how large this fat body is. And through this fat body, they make food for the entire colony. So I'm going to pop back one more slide. We can look at this picture again for another minute. So when the bees are developing as larvae, the fat body is almost the entire larva. It's this whole kind of, a larva is a gooey soup in a sack, right? And a lot of that gooey soup is their fat body, but it's kind of distributed throughout their whole body. As the bee goes through each instar, which is a stage of metamorphosis, each time they go through a stage of metamorphosis, the organs become a little bit more distinct each time. And that fat body begins to move into place into what will be the abdomen. When the bee is born, she has a really small fat body, and she's fed by other nurse bees. And that fat body fattens up, and she gains a lot of nutrition. And with that, she's then able to become a nurse bee herself and feed others. So the fat body it stores all of that energy within the nurse bees. And so we can look at pollen stores and we can look at nectar stores and feed the bees, but there's no way for us to know as beekeepers how that fat body is functioning. And it is the most important part of the hive, because that is the only place where pollen actually becomes food. And as we're going to see a little bit later in the presentation, it starts out small, it grows large in the nurse bees, and then it, like a lot of the glands on bees, it slowly diminishes. Bees have a whole series of glands that come online through different stages in their lives, and the fat bodies are primarily in the nurse bees. So we want to learn a little bit about those, protect them, and develop them so that our colonies can grow larger and stay healthy. So let's take a quick look at what vitellogenin is, and then we're going to move on to pollen and the different things that the fat body does for the bees. So all animals have vitellogenin. Bees are animals, all animals have it. In other animals, it's called an egg yolk protein precursor, which is kind of the essential building blocks of egg yolks. And most animals, when they reproduce, each female produces eggs using vitellogenin from her body. Even human beings have vitellogenin, and it's what we make our eggs out of. But worker bees in normal circumstances don't lay eggs. They don't even make eggs, right? Their reproduction is suppressed. They have the cooperative brood rearing where only the queen makes and lay eggs. So since workers aren't laying eggs, they have all of this unused vitellogenin. And so what they did is they evolved to use this vitellogenin to feed the entire colony. And when the nurse bees feed, they don't just, we think of them feeding larvae and brood and baby bees, but the nurse bees also feed drones and the queens, and they feed the foragers. Because as bees get older, their fat body begins to atrophy, and foragers can't create enough protein to repair their own bodies without the help of the nurse bees feeding them. And the nurse bees are feeding out the vitellogenin from these healthy fat bodies. So pollen is the only source of protein in a colony. Most pollen is about somewhere around 25% protein. Nectar has a lot of carbohydrates and a little bit of some minerals and vitamins in it. Mostly it's just pure carbohydrates. Most of the nutrition in a colony comes from the pollen. And this is real pollen, not pollen supplements. It needs to be something gathered in nature with all of the enzymes and the really good benefits that we haven't even discovered all the benefits of pollen yet. And the supplements that we give them are good to kind of bridge those dearth periods and in the winter. But we want to make sure they have a lot of natural pollen with the amino acids available to them. Honeybees need a lot of pollen. A single colony will bring in somewhere between 30 and 90 pounds of pollen in a year, which is kind of a staggering amount. If you think about, even say 50 pounds of pollen, one little pollen pad at a time, on the bees' little corbiculae pollen pants there, is just 90, 50 pounds of pollen is a lot. And the funny thing is we see it sometimes packed in the storage in the cells, but bees oftentimes consume it just as fast as it's coming in the door. The thing that compels the bees to bring in more pollen, as we know, is the presence of brood, because brood are the members of the colony that are growing so fast and have a really high demand for all of that protein that they're getting in the pollen. So when you see a frame that has a lot of brood on it, you have to think of it. This is kind of how I look at brood when I think of it now. Is it's a nursery full of crying babies. They're all hungry. They need that protein. They send out a pheromone. Open brood has pheromones, and they communicate to the nurse bees that they're hungry. And based on that, then the nurse bees and the foragers know that more pollen needs to come in. And that's what stimulates the gathering of pollen. And that's the professional beekeepers, when they fulfill their contracts, they need to have a certain number of frames of brood, because then when they take that hive out to do pollination, then we know that there's going to be a lot of bees out there gathering and foraging for pollen. And so during times of brood up, the pheromone can get really high in the colony. So let's take a look at the different kinds of food that the bees use the pollen to make. So the first one we talked about is vitellogenin. And vitellogenin is what comes straight out of the fat body. It's mostly protein, and it's got some fat and a little bit of sugar in it. But the basic building block of the bee's food is the vitellogenin. Then when it goes up into the hypopharyngeal gland, the bee can make brood food out of it. And brood food when it goes through the mandibular glands, they add in a little bit more water, they dilute it down, and then there's more protein and some more sugar. And then there's also fats and vitamins and enzymes. Some of the things are naturally occurring in the plants, and some of the things the nurse bees add in. We'll see a little bit more of that later when we talk about immunity. And then royal jelly is about half vitellogenin, and there's a tiny bit of pollen in it. The queen bees don't feed themselves in any way. They don't drink water, they don't drink nectar. So the royal jelly has all of the water and the food and everything that the queen needs in it, all in one. It's like a protein shake for the queen. And then you can see here, as the bees are feeding, this is coming out of their mandible glands here. And then the queen puts her trophallaxis tongue out, and the mandibular glands excrete food for her. And then it makes it really handy having those right on the mandibles, because then the bees can just kind of pop their head down into the cell with the larvae and feed those larvae. So let's look at the different things that the fat body does for the bee. The first thing it does is it provides proteins. It makes vitellogenin for energy and for feeding, processes pollen into protein. It also is a storage. It's a communal pantry of food. So all of the protein that the colony is going to consume is actually contained within the fat body of the nurse bees. Now, the nurse bees can eat the pollen out of the cells, the bee bread out of the cells, and make more vitellogenin, but it only comes from the nurse bees and the middle-aged bees a little bit. All of the protein that is actually edible to most of the colony is in the fat bodies of the nurse bees. The fat body also helps to detoxify. It's like a liver. It filters out all of the pesticides and helps keep them healthy through filtering. And then it also creates hormones and pheromones. And we're going to learn a little bit more about those coming up. Hormones and pheromones are the language of the colony. And all of those are created within the fat body. And the fat body also helps to regulate temperature. When bees manage temperature, it's called thermal regulation. And the fat body both insulates the bee and it produces the hormones that let the bee know whether it's too hot or too cold. And this regulation is what stimulates the bees to fan their wings to cool off the hive in summer or to vibrate and generate heat in the winter. So bees that have damaged fat bodies may be unaware that the colony is getting too warm or too cold, and that can contribute to colony stress and winter losses. And then the immune function also resides within the fat bodies. The vitellogenin contains little fragments of viruses, and the nurse bees use that to prime the immune system of newly emerged bees. Bees have, as individuals, little individual animals, bees have the lowest immunity of any animal in the animal kingdom. They do not have antibodies, and they're born with very low immune resources. So they have what's called social immunity. And bees' immunity comes from activities like grooming, shivering to stay warm, and trophallaxis. They share bits of broken virus with each other, and they then share the immunity with each other. So without the entire colony engaging in activities like lining the inside of the colony with, see, here goes my brain's going offline. Sorry. Um, uh, trees. So you guys all know what it is. Sorry, sorry. They line the inside with propolis. Thank you. They line the inside of the hive with propolis. All of these activities that bees do creates the social immunity for the entire colony. And the fat bodies and the sharing of broken viruses is a really important part of a bee's immune system. We'll take a little closer look at that here. So remember recently, um, they came up with the vaccine against American foul brood, and that is actually stored in the bee's fat body. So what they did is they took a lot of queen bees and they fed the workers around the queen bee, they fed them broken virus from American foul brood. And the worker bees then fed that to the queen. So the queen is then inoculated against American foul brood by prophylaxis with the worker bees. And the queen then passes that on to her eggs. So there is intergenerational transfer of vitellogenin as her vitellogenin goes into the eggs with some of that broken virus. So she then has daughters that are also immune or vaccinated against American foul brood. And all of that is through the transfer of broken virus through vitellogenin. So there's two ways that vitellogenin feeding primes young bees against disease. First, through the egg from the queen, and second, but that's through the vitellogenin that goes into the egg. And then second is through the brood food that comes from the nurse bees. So let's go into a concept now. We talked a little bit about the fat body as an organ and how it creates the food for bees, but also how it creates their immunity. And I want you to keep in mind the immunity piece when we get towards the end of the lecture. We're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to bring all this back, of course, to varroa mites, right? Where we started the Sammy Ramsey with varroa mites, we're going to end up a little bit with varroa mites. And we're going to talk a little bit about viruses. So I want you to kind of hold in your mind the idea that the fat body really helps the bees' immunity and helps them to fight off diseases and viruses. But now we're going to move on to plasticity in aging. So bees are one of the few animals that can actually change how long they live. They can either be a summer bee that lives a few months, 6 to 8 weeks during the summer, or they can be a winter bee that lives sometimes up to 6 months. They've actually done studies in laboratories with worker bees where they were able to keep their fat bodies large. And the way they keep their fat bodies large is by not feeding brood. Okay, when they feed brood, when they feed other bees, or even the queen, that's what depletes their fat body. So bees that have not been required to feed anyone else and maintain those really large fat bodies have lived in laboratories up to 2 years for a worker bee. So the fat body is like the clock in the bee, and how large it stays and how healthy it stays determines how long the individual bee lives. And of course, how long the individual bee lives determines how large and robust your colony grows, how many members are there longer, right? So the fat body helps the bees to live longer. And as they use up that fat body over time, and it gets smaller and smaller, then the bee eventually dies. Um, So we're going to take a quick look at how honeybees age. So some of this is, and this is stuff you guys know already, but what I'm going to do is put this aging and task process that bees go through in the context of how their fat body is functioning at each age. So at the very bottom here, we're going to talk about how the size of the fat body, and then this little red dot here is also just a graphical picture of how large the fat body is at that time in their life. So day 1 through 3, the bee emerges and it's got a really small, not yet fully developed fat body. And this is assuming there was no varroas in there, right? That she was never parasitized. She's got a small, healthy fat body. And the other nurse bees feed her and for a couple of days, 1 through 3. And as she's being fed, her fat body grows and matures. So she then can become a nurse bee herself. And she goes out and she starts to seek out stored bee bread and honey in the nearby cells. Now, remember, it's only the nurse bees with these nice fat bodies that actually eat the bee bread. This is why when you look in a colony, you can see that the bees keep the pollen right near the brood because that's where the nurse bees are. And the nurse bees don't wander all over the colony looking for food. They've got their bees that they take care of, and that food needs to be right nearby. So when I find the brood nest, I always try and make sure that we've got some pollen right next to the brood nest, and I never take that pollen frame and move it out to the outside. That needs to stay right near the babies where the nurse bees are. So then days 3 through 12, the fat body is fully developed. It's large. It's cranking out a lot of vitellogenin. Between days 3 and 12 is a really important time for both the individual bee and for the entire colony. And the fat body is at its largest size, and it is a powerhouse of synthesizing pollen into vitellogenin. Also, the needs for protein is at the highest point in her life, and she will consume large amounts of bee bread to help feed the brood out or to fatten up and become a winter bee, as we'll see later. So the bees, when they feed out the vitellogenin from their fat body, they're actually sacrificing their longevity and their protein needs for the good of the colony. Everything that the bees do is for the good of the colony. So day 12 through 20 is when they are the middle-aged worker bees. And this is when their fat body begins to show use. It's starting to shrink a little bit. And the next glands that start coming online are their wax glands, and they become builders, consuming more syrup. Most wax production comes from the consumption of nectar and syrup. And their needs for protein drop off rapidly because they're no longer doing nursing duties. But their fat body is still large enough to maintain their own body and their own activities. So as older bees getting ready to be foragers, they become guard bees and undertaker bees and processing the nectar and the pollen. And this is where their fat body begins to shrink. They can still mostly support their own vitellogenin production, but it's kind of getting a little marginal. Their fat body is shrinking and they just don't make as much vitellogenin anymore. And by the time they are out and being a forager, their fat bodies have shrunk to almost nothing. Now, they don't need as much protein anymore. All they need to do is be able to repair their own body. They're not feeding others. But the foragers will go out and they will pick up pollen and nectar and bring it back, and they'll get some food from the nurse bees. They'll do trophallaxis with the nurse bees, get some protein from the nurse bees, and then head back out again. So the nurse bees are actually feeding the foragers their proteins. And once the foragers are outside the hive, they rapidly use up any vitellogenin left that they have stored in their fat bodies. They literally use up every drop of protein, and that fat body has become so small that it can't make vitellogenin anymore. And they just keep foraging and going until they're completely depleted. and then they die in the field. And in doing this, what they've done is they haven't taken any of that stored vitellogenin out with them. It's a really efficient way to make sure that all of the vitellogenin in the hive goes to service in the colony, and it's not left out in the field with the forager. It's kind of sad, but it's really efficient. So let's talk a little bit about hormones and pheromones. Um, so hormones and pheromones are the language of the colony. A pheromone is like a scent that's exuded, and it's a conversation between bees. Okay, one exudes a scent, the other smells it. The brood exudes a hunger pheromone, and the nurse bees pick that up, and they know that the brood is hungry. A hormone is a communication within an individual that creates a physiological change in that individual. So the brood, for example, the brood is sending out a whole lot of pheromone that says they're hungry. They're hungry. And there's not enough um, bee bread for the nurse bees to eat to feed the brood. So what that does is that continued inundation of pheromones creates a hormonal change within that nurse bee. They need more foragers. So that nurse bee matures more quickly into a forager. So there's this whole dance amongst the bees between the needs of the colony and how quickly the bees age or don't age based on the needs. So it's a really precise and delicate dance of pheromone messages and the hormone responses that it elicits within the bees. So, for example, there's been some experiments done that demonstrate this plasticity. In one experiment, all of the foragers were removed from a colony. And as the forager pheromone went down and the call for food went up, this caused those middle-aged bees to mature into foragers faster. Or in another case, a large amount of foragers were added to a test colony, causing the pheromone volume of foragers to go up. This resulted in those middle-aged bees maturing more slowly, since additional foragers weren't needed then. And in a third experiment, all of the nurse bees were removed from a colony. And since there was fewer nurses to feed the brood, that hunger pheromone from the brood shot up, and it was found that some of the early foragers could actually revert back to being nurse bees. Now, they don't do it quite as well as a full-on nurse bee. It's a little ad hoc, but early foragers can revert to being nurse bees. And I think that's kind of how swarms work, right? That the bees can change a little bit how they age, and a group of bees that can fly and go out and swarm can actually still be nurse bees within the colony also, in the new colony. As beekeepers, we sometimes change that balance of bees between nurses and foragers. So let's say they've got their balance all set. They've got their brood and the right number of nurse bees, and they've got the right number of foragers out there bringing in food. And then we decide to do a split, or we decide that we've got a weaker or a stronger colony and we need to shift some of that brood back and forth. It's because they can adapt to this and change the rate at which they age, that they can adapt to our changes that we're making in their colony structure. And that's why Randy Oliver says that you can raise queens with young foragers if they're given a few days to revert. Now, you probably wouldn't make as good a queen as full-on nurse bees, but I think it's fascinating how bees can change how they age. So now we're going to move on a little bit, and we're going to look at fat bees, how fat bodies make fat bees. So winter bees are also known as Dutinous bees. Fat bees, winter bees, Dutinous bees, they're all kind of the same thing. They are the ones that can live until spring. And Dutinous, the word Dutinous basically means long lasting. They, although they were born from the same eggs and fed and treated the same as young bees, um, winter bees are physiologically different than summer bees, and they're sometimes considered to be a fourth class of bee. So, it, to my way of thinking, there's queens, drones, summer workers, and winter bees. It's really helpful to think of those winter bees as a separate class. And we're going to see a little bit further on in the presentation how to make sure that we maximize our winter bees, their health and the number of them, and to increase our chances of helping that colony to get through winter. So unlike normal foragers, winter bees don't age through tasks. They have the ability to do any task in the colony at any time. They can feed brood that the queen is laying. They can generate heat. They can cool. They can do all of the things. They can go out and forage if it's a sunny day, if there's a few dandelions blooming. So they can do any task. And this makes sure that the colony can function well in winter, even as some of the bees die off. So in the Pacific Northwest, bees are primarily made in September. As the days start getting short, I'm sorry, winter bees are made in September. As the days get shorter, bear with me, I'm sorry guys, it's been a heck of a week. So as the days get shorter and the natural forage begins to decline, the brood nest contracts. That's one of the first ways we know that fall is coming, because we go into our hive and we go, oh my gosh, I'm not sure if I have a queen. I'm not seeing any brood, right? Or the brood nest has gotten so small. So what that means is that generation of nurse bees doesn't have very many babies to feed. So they can hold on to their fat bodies. So this creating of a winter bee happens on its own as the queen responds to temperature, as it gets colder, day length, with the days getting shorter, and a lack of natural forage. As that pollen stops coming in, queen naturally stops laying as many eggs. And as that brood nest contracts, those nurse bees don't have babies to feed. They hold on to their fat bodies, and that helps them to live through the entire winter. So these bees are the bridge generation. They stay in the colony during the cold months, and they have to live long enough to get to spring, where they nurse and forage for that first round of new bees. So in the spring, when the queen starts laying again, then all of a sudden there's brood to feed. Then those winter bees resume a normal aging cycle and live for a few, another month or two. From February, March into April, we see by the time we get to early May, we generally see the last of those winter bees kind of dying off. But those are the ones that hang on all the way through winter. So again, what makes a winter bee is there's less brood pheromone. So I heard it stated once, what makes a winter bee? And there's seemed to be a little bit of controversy around it, but it seemed to boil down to two things. There's less brood pheromone. When there's less brood pheromone, then the nurse bees are not hormonally changed to feed out their fat body, right? The hunger pheromones from the brood, that pheromone creates a hormonal change in the bee that compels her to feed her fat body out to the brood. So less brood creates less brood pheromone, which then it's a little bit redundant, but then it creates no nursing. So then those bees hold on to their fat bodies. So there are two conditions. There's a lot of overlap there, but they are distinct things. So let's look briefly here at how vitellogenin transfers between the different bees. So this is kind of the whole vitellogenin transfer in one picture, what we went through in a couple of slides. So the y-axis here is how long the bee is going to live, how much longer she's going to live. And the green lightning bolt is how much vitellogenin she makes. The red dot is how big her fat body is. And the red arrow is how much she's either feeding or being fed by others. And if it's a small arrow, then it's not very much. And if it's a large arrow, then she's feeding a lot. So first, this first one is a normal path of aging. The young bee emerges. She has a small fat body, and she is fed by other bees. Then as she ages and becomes a nurse bee between days 5 and 12, she makes a lot of vitellogenin, and she starts feeding it out to others. And then as she becomes a more mature nurse bee, she's feeding out a lot of her vitellogenin. She's making a lot of it and feeding a lot of it out. And then as she becomes a forager, her fat body has become very small, and she can't produce enough protein to support her body anymore. And so when she comes back to the hive, she's fed by nurse bees until her fat body is completely gone and she expires in the field. But there's a couple of other paths. So we've got the winter bee path here, where rather than becoming a nurse bee, there's no brood to feed. She can keep that very large fat body and a high level of vitellogenin production. Or another alternate aging path is as she becomes a forager, if something happens and suddenly they need more, the bees need more nurse bees, then this forager can actually revert. Now you notice her fat body isn't quite as big as the strongest nurse bees, but she can revert, bring that fat body back online and help to feed the colony. So let's briefly take a look here at varroa mites. So we're going to circle back to Sammy Ramsey and things that damage a bee's fat body. So by far the largest threat to bees is varroa mites. Now, 80% of colony losses are directly attributable to the effects of varroa. So again, that's to my way of thinking, 80% of colony losses are due to the effects of varroa. And I've been challenged on that before, but I think it's by people who don't hear when I say the effects of varroa. The varroa themselves don't kill the bee, but it damages her fat body to the point where it shortens her life dramatically, and the varroa bring in viruses. So prior to varroa arriving in the United States, and you can ask the old timers, they'd say, oh yeah, we lose about 10 to 15% of our hives every year. We lose 1 or 2 out of 10 hives every year. And now with hobbyists, that's at 50%. And this year with the commercial guys, they lost 62%. And we now know, I don't know if you've seen the report yet, they came out that it was primarily due to viruses brought on by varroa that were resistant to apivar. So I stand by that 80% of our modern colony losses are directly attributable to the effects of varroa. So let's look at how varroa compromise the fat body, how that part works, and then we're going to look at a little bit at viruses. In the larval stage of development, remember that those creamy insides of the larva is like a mush of organs that slowly takes shape as the bee goes through different instars, different metamorphoses. So when the varroa latches on, it is really easy for it to feed on the fat body. And in fact, they found that the location that the varroa attaches in the pupa is literally right where that fat body is. So it basically is eating a nutritious soup that the bee would have used to form its fat body. So for summer bees, this stunts their growth. They come out smaller and they only live they just live a few weeks. They're never able to fully function as a nurse bee because their fat body has been damaged. It's a permanent effect, and the bee never recovers from it. They're smaller and shorter lived. So while these damaged bees can get food from other nurse bees and survive for a few weeks, they never are able to grow the big fat bodies of a healthy 5-day-old nurse bee. And in one bee, that doesn't seem like a lot, but when you multiply that times the number of bees that are getting damaged by the varroa, it causes a dwindling in the hive. Your hive doesn't grow as big and healthy as it could, and it's not able to forage for as much food stores for the winter. So a damaged bee produces less vitellogenin, makes less wax, has less energy to grow into strong guard bees, and having reduced fat bodies shortens their life as a forager. In doing that, it also creates a greater demand for more nurse bees because the nurse bees that they've got aren't able to feed anyone. So what that does is that you get more hunger, pheromone from the brood, which holds more of those bees to be the healthy bees to be nurse bees, and they're not able to mature and go out and become foragers. So it becomes kind of this vicious downward spiral where they just can't get enough food to feed the colony, and they can't also spare any nurse bees to go out and become foragers. So it's really, really a tough spiral. So it's really, really can be devastating. And the funny thing is, it's invisible. As beekeepers, we can't see it. We can see that for some reason the colony's not growing as much as it seems like they should. Um, but you can't look at a bee and tell that she has a damaged fat body. They look just the same as every other bee. And damaged fat bodies cause dead outs. Uh, so when a bee that has a damaged fat body cannot become a winter bee. They are stuck with no more than that 6 to 8 week or less lifespan with a damaged fat body. They just don't have the reserves to process the protein and to store that energy that they need to get through winter. So in summer, it might show up as a less populated colony, but in winter, it's catastrophic. Those compromised bees all hit the end of their lifespan by midwinter, and boom, the colony collapses because there's not enough bees left to generate the heat the cluster needs. So this is called dwindling. This dwindling causes the dead outs. What happens is these bees slowly start dying off. Then the colony gets smaller and smaller, and they're no longer able to generate enough heat to keep everyone warm. Bees are very altruistic. When they are sick, they take themselves out of the colony to die. Occasionally, there'll be a little work for the undertakers to get a few bees out of there, but for the most part, sick bees go off and die in the field. And that's why when you open a dead out, you find a dead out that was caused by uh, a virus or by lack of fat bees, some kind of damage from varroa. You find a thin layer of bees on the bottom board, and then you see this cluster of bees. When they have their heads in the cells like this is not a sign of starvation. This is where they go to generate heat. They climb in the cells and they vibrate and they shiver to generate heat for the whole colony. And then everybody else around them kind of hangs around and forms that mantle and stays warm. So this is a sign of bees dying of cold, not starvation. A starvation death, they're healthy. They're all staying in the colony. No one's going off. There's no need. They're not sick. And they suddenly run out of food. And boom, they all die at once. Boom. That's where you get an inch or two of dead bees on the bottom board. So when you've got a dead out from starvation, there is a lot of bees on the bottom board. But these dwindling deaths, where they're clustered up like this, and oftentimes moldy, is from varroa mites. And imagine being in the woods and you've got a campfire trying to stay warm. And it's kind of damp and foggy out. And you build that fire up really big. And that fire, that heat, pushes off the humidity and all the dampness, and you're able to stay warm. But as that fire gets smaller and smaller, that humidity and the dampness starts to come in, and it gets harder and harder to stay warm with a smaller fire. And that's kind of why we see moldy bees. It's not the cold that got them, and it's not the dampness that got them. It's simply not having enough bees because they were dying off either due to damaged fat bodies or viruses caused by varroa. So let's take a look at, so we've talked about the damage to the fat body and how that shortens the lifespan. We're going to take a quick look at viruses because that's the secondary effect that varroa damage has. And it overwhelms their fat body that they can't have enough immunity. So we've all seen this picture before where the bees peak, June, July, and the varroa proportionately peak after that. And it's this bridge where this gap here in August where the varroa tend to overwhelm the bees. And the common advice here that we get is watch in October, treat for your varroa mites. I'm sorry, not October, August. Treat for your varroa mites in August because that's when this gap is the largest. And if you don't get anything else out of this presentation, I want to help folks understand that I think that August is too late. So the next thing we're going to look at here is the viruses that are here in red. So it takes bees about 4 to 6 weeks to clear viruses out of their colony. So along with the varroa damaging the fat bodies, when they bring viruses, this gap is actually much wider than what people think. When you have a generation of bees that have been parasitized by varroa, you have sick nurse bees. And even if her fat body was not directly eaten by a varroa mite, she might have gotten a hole chewed in her by a varroa mite as an adult bee, and the viruses get in that way, or the varroa injects that virus in. A sick nurse bee cannot raise a healthy brood, right? It just takes more, once again, it takes more nurse bees to feed and care for that brood if the nurse bees are sick. And if it takes 4 weeks for that nurse bee to clear the virus, you've lost an entire month there. So first off, when we are managing varroa, we need to start in May. Instead of having this curve go up, we need to keep that curve flat all summer long. So they're not getting these viruses. This most recent colony collapse disorder that was caused by resistant varroa primarily showed up as a paralysis virus and as deformed wing virus. So we need to keep the varroa from getting high. So however you manage your varroa, if you treat or if you do brood breaks or whatever you do, it needs to start before that curve goes up. Because by the time we get over here into August, if you have a high varroa count, it's too late. They've already have massively damaged fat bodies and a viral load that will not let them live through the winter. So varroa lags behind bees in buildup, and viruses lag behind varroa. So this is a bit of a complex graph. I just love it. It's a little complex. Don't worry about trying to get every single little part of it in. Just notice here, so this is, each of these bands is a generation of bees. So it takes 12 days for brood to emerge. So each of these bands represents a 12-day generation of bees. So we've got eggs down here in the bottom, and we've got capped brood that's brown, and then we've got successive generations. So here on September 12th, here's the yellow generation, and then we can see this yellow generation as they slowly dwindle a little bit all the way through December 5th. And then we've got an orange generation and a green generation. You can see by the time we get to December, it's these bees that were born in September and a little bit in October are our winter bees, right? The yellow, orange, and green, these are our winter bees. So where was I going? So this is the time frame when your winter bees are made, is starting kind of the end of August through September. These bees here are the nurse bees that are feeding your winter bees. If you have a generation of sick nurse bees that can't make winter bees, you actually need to back your treatments up by a month. So if you've been staying on top of your varroa all summer long, then you're probably fine to really pay attention in August and make sure those counts don't go up in August. But if you haven't been hitting your varroa management earlier in the year, starting in April and May, and your varroa get out of control, then you're going to need to back up your treatment and start it earlier. I like to start treating. I start my winter treatments for varroa around the middle of July. And the reason for that is because it takes 21 days to get through a round of varroa treatment. You've got or maybe 24 days. So let's say you're doing formic, you've got a 10-day and a 14-day. Or if you're doing Thymol or even rounds of oxalic acid, take 12 days to get through. It takes time to get through the treatment, to know that you've gotten as many varroa out of your colony as you can. And I think that what this August start date for treatments does is it doesn't take into consideration the time for the treatment. So you need to have clean nurse bees in August. You want to have really, really healthy nurse bees in August, because September is when they're making your winter bees. I hope that makes sense. But everybody talks about doing the treatments in August when really they need to be done by August. So I start in July so that I've got healthy nurse bees in August, ready, born and ready to feed my winter bees starting in September. The takeaways here are how to protect your bees and how to help them over winter. You want to make sure that you've got a lot of pollen available to them, a variety of pollen sources. Supplement when needed with pollen patties. I tend to be pretty generous with the pollen patties. I keep a little bit on all winter long because I can look at my hive in winter and I can see that I've given them sugar cookies or some kind of top feeder in the winter, but I can't see how much pollen they have in that colony. And I personally don't believe that the pollen supplements that we have trigger excessive brood rearing in the middle of winter. I think it just helps them to make sure that their fat bodies are staying large and keeping those bees living as long as possible. And then you want to manage your varroa, keeping the varroa to the lowest levels possible using proven methods, and keep them low all year. If you get to August and you have a high mite count, your bees may not survive that. So, and that's why I like doing this talk this time of year, because it's not too late. This is actually the time of year when our brood numbers are so high and the varroa numbers are starting to go up. So this is the time when we really need to get on it and stay diligent through the rest of the year. So I hope that there was some takeaway information here that was helpful and interesting. And let's see here. I am going to take off my share screen and see if anyone has any questions. Oh, there's me, my picture.
Question. All right. Can you hear the speaker ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned if there's one thing we can take away from your lecture is this, and I forgot what it is. What is it that you want to say?
Treat early and often.
Early and often. That's right. Thank you.
Oh,
I have another
Go ahead.
question. So, you mentioned that the fat bodies are useful in the detoxification of whatever. Is that something that's like is flushed out of the system, or does it just stay in there? They have like, how does that? I guess is it like, if they get into something, does it stay in their system forever, or is it flushed out of the fat bodies?
Yeah, the bees filter the they filter the toxins through their fat bodies, similar to how we do with a liver. And then it goes out into it's in their goes into their hemolymph, and they've got it's almost like a colon, but it's got these little tubes that stick out into the hemolymph that then pull the toxins in, and then they poop it out. So they've got this, I can't remember what it's called. It's this funny organ that almost looks like fingers on the end of a colon that helps to pull toxins out of the bee's hemolymph. And the fat, I don't know the mechanics of how the fat body filters it, but that you hit the end of my knowledge there.
Thanks.
Uh-huh.
preferred treatment.
Oh, mine?
Yeah.
I tend to treat pretty aggressively. I have a vaporizer, and I use it every 4 to 6 weeks. If brood's present, I do 3 in a row. If not, I do a single treatment. So I treat every 4 to 6 weeks year round. And then I do, in the fall, I do one Formic Pro treatment on everybody, just so it's an alternate treatment. And that's when the bees are at the highest risk. So that's how I kind of make sure that no varroa bombs are showing up in my hive from somewhere else. And I've had an 80% overwintering rate. And I really like the oxalic acid. It's so gentle. I've seen them raise queens. I've actually seen them raise queens even using formic acid when you do the single pad half covered method. So I feel pretty comfortable that everything I'm using is not too hard on them.
Do you have any experience with the new Viroxan strips?
No, I don't. I looked them up, and they were more expensive than what I wanted to pay for them. So I make my own sponges. I use the sponges year round, and I keep them on nonstop, changing them out every 4 to 6 weeks.
So you're doing that in addition to vaporizing?
Yeah, like I said, I treat aggressively. I treat aggressively with very gentle products.
What do you put on the sponges? What do you soak the sponges in?
Let's see if I can find there's while we're talking, I'll find it for you. I use Cayman Reynolds has a recipe that's really easy to make for the extended release oxalic acid sponges. And it's basically 2 cups of glycerin and 2 cups of oxalic acid, and you gently heat it on the stove. And you pour it over 10 sponges. And that isn't 10 sponges is enough to last your 2 hives for the entire year.
Throw them in like Ziploc bags?
Yep. You can keep them in the freezer if you want to, but generally they that will hold for the whole summer without deteriorating too bad.
Randy Oliver has a recipe online for that for us for like a single hive. It's like 50 grams of glycerin to 50 grams of oxalic acid.
Or 500 grams. Yep.
So where do you buy this stuff? What's the source on glycerin?
You can buy both on Amazon. Two components, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of hobby stores have glycerin because it's used in soap making. But I buy it all on Amazon.
I know
Oopsie, hang on.
Oopsie. Are you using the oxalic acid?
Oh dear, there's my YouTube just went off when I tried to copy it. So I'm putting this into the link here. I believe this is Cayman Reynolds recipe.
What respiratory protection are you using when you're dealing with the oxalic acid and making the sponges?
When I'm making the sponges, it doesn't vaporize when you're making sponges. So but you do want to be very careful with your stainless, if you have a stainless steel stovetop, because it will, if you drip it on there, it will etch it. So I tend to use a much bigger pan than what's needed, and I'm very careful when I pour it. But I cut the sponges in half, and I put them in a plastic shoebox or a tub, as close fitting one as I can find. And then I gently heat the glycerin and the oxalic acid until it goes translucent. So you can use a wooden spoon to stir it. And oxalic acid is wood bleach. So that's kind of nice. It actually takes the tomato sauce stains off of your wooden spoons. And so you use your wooden spoon and you stir it, and then you take it out on the patio or the driveway, and you just kind of pour it over and let it soak up. And you take tongs and flip it over so that it's soaking in really well, and then you put it in a bag, and it's really inexpensive. And I found that using the sponges and keeping them on nonstop actually keeps a lot of the mite counts down to somewhere between 2 and 4. And I'm not comfortable 100% relying on that as my only treatment yet. At some point, I might vaporize less in addition to that, but so far it doesn't seem harmful to the bees, and I like my overwintering rate, so I just haven't been motivated to treat less yet. Although I'm running 50 hives this year, and so I am finding that I'm getting a little less consistent. I'm running out of time. I'm getting a little less consistent on the treatment. So I'm going to go out and do some testing and make sure that maybe the pads are holding it to a good level. But I'm going to go out and check this week.
So what technique do you use to monitor your mites, or you just depend on this, that you use these constant treatments, you don't bother checking?
Yeah, the bottom board I think is great after treatment. So I use the bottom board method mostly to see the mite drop related to treatment, because that tells me how many mites were phoretic at the time. When I'm actually trying to get a solid count, part of what I do is queen rearing. And so for queen rearing, it's really important to have a solid, consistent method to count and compare between your hives. And so for them, I just do a standard alcohol wash. And that's if for any reason they spike a high mite count, then that queen is not used for making other queens.
Any other questions?
I just want to say thank you, because we're in our third season of beekeeping, and it amazes me how the winter bees get fat and survive. And now I understand it, and the bees are so cool. It's like, how do they do that? How do they know? It's a bee thing, but now I have a biology behind it. I really appreciate your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's my goal, because we're all told to treat your bees, or they might not overwinter, but I'm one of those people that it sticks better if I understand why. And when you see those mites and you know exactly why it's causing that colony to collapse in winter, and you go out on Facebook and you see folks saying, well, my bees froze to death, or it was the damp, or something like that, and you look at that cluster pattern on the frame and you go, at some point the mites may very well have been too high, causing a high virus level. And yeah, so if you go ahead.
Can you say that again about that clustering? I kind of missed that piece, that people say they had a dead out and all the bees were face into the cells and they starved.
Yeah.
And you're saying if they starved, they'd be on the bottom board. And if it's the mites, they're face into the cells because you said something about heat.
Yeah, there's two primary causes of dead outs in the winter. One is starvation and the other is dwindling.
Okay, so the dwindling is that effect where you see them in the cells.
Yep.
And
Yep.
why are they in the cells if they're dwindling?
Well, when bees heat their colony, what they do is there's a number of different activities that go into heating a colony. They've actually put infrared lights on colonies and they can identify heater bees. And the heater bees vibrate their thorax and generate heat. But the way they do that is they go headfirst into the cell and they generate heat within the cells. So you get a whole bunch of heater bees all together in a cells, and they're making literally a heater in the middle of the colony. And then the bees that are outside of the cells fan that heat, and they circulate the heat amongst all the other bees. And then on the outside of the cluster is the mantle. And the mantle is an insulating layer that helps keep everybody warm. So when you see the bees head first into the cell, those are the heater bees trying desperately to generate enough heat to keep the whole colony warm. But there's a reduced number of heater bees, reduced number of fanner bees, and a much thinner mantle. And so, a smaller cluster, the heat the cold just sinks right in. Whereas with a starvation death, they're all fine. They're able to generate heat. They just all suddenly starve to death. When they're dwindling, it's often from viruses or cold, and they leave the colony. They get sick. Bees are really, really susceptible to the cold. And we see that in the spring when the brood diseases set in. They get chalk brood or EFB or these different viruses that affect the cold. We talked about their immune system. Their immune system on their own is really not very strong, and they're especially susceptible to cold. So when they aren't able to generate enough heat, that's when the viruses really do the most damage. So the dwindling is often a precursor to a death by viruses, I believe.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any benefit for using grease patties in the winter?
You mean for tracheal mites?
For nutrition.
Grease patties?
Yeah. Can they extract fat from that?
Oh, no. It's called a fat body, but it's more protein than fat. I think it's called a fat body because it looks like a piece of fat, not so much because it's made up of all fat. The only time I've heard grease patties used is with menthol for tracheal mites.
Good to know.
Yeah. And which we don't need anymore because the things that are effective against varroa mites are also effective against tracheal mites.
Okay, any more questions?
For what it's worth, we've been keeping bees for 46 years. In the olden days, before mites, you had to work at killing them. And now you have to work at making them survive. It's amazing the difference.
Yeah.
The normal mites and making beekeeping.
Yeah, I heard someone say once that there are no bad beekeepers nowadays. If you have bees, then you're probably a better beekeeper than, you know more about it than the guys in the 70s, right? Because we really have to work hard to keep them alive now. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Dawn.
you.
Thank you
I
so much.
really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you. And I hope go out there and however you handle your mites, handle them. And I hope this helps. I hope this helps your overwintering rate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.